Before I do an introduction, welcome the 89 people that are already on the call. Because I'm complete technophobe, I'm going to ask Genevieve to explain how this is all going to work. We hope it's how it's going to work. Genevieve.
Good morning, everyone. So happy to be joining you all on this call, and we're so happy to have so many people here. Yes, around 200 people registered for the call, and we're thrilled to see everyone here today. Yeah, I'm just going to share a couple logistics before we kick off the call. In terms of the format, we will have first a round of initial presentations after an introduction from Madeleine, and then a very short moderated discussion with some pre-prepared questions. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Anne Atambo from WILPF Kenya, was unable to join us today due to a sort of last minute thing that came up. So we're very sorry that she could not be on the call, but we're excited for the rest of the discussion. And after the moderated component, we will have at least half an hour for a sort of interactive Q&A. Currently, all of you are on mute, as you know, sort of to control the background noise, but we are hoping to have a super interactive discussion. So there's a few ways you can participate in the call. First, you can type questions in the chat box. We will be looking at the chat box throughout the call, and we will be collecting those questions, and then we're hoping to get to as many of those as possible during the Q&A period. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment out loud after the moderated discussion, you can use the raise your hand function, or you can type your name into the chat box, and then you can, Madeleine will call on you and you can unmute your mic. We would also encourage you to join the discussion on Twitter if you're on Twitter. You can tweet using the hashtag Feminist Alternatives. And just so everyone is aware, this call, we're currently figuring out how to concurrently live stream it on Facebook Live so that a recording will be available there. And this call is being recorded. So just so everyone is aware of that before we kick off the discussion in case of any privacy concerns. So thank you so much. And we're really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Genevieve. I hope everyone's got all of that. I'll probably make a mess, and at some point there will be dogs barking in the background. I'm just looking at the chat box, and there are people here from absolutely everywhere all over the world, which is amazing and extremely good that we have such an incredible participation. Thank you. Just a quick introduction who I am. I'm Madeleine Rees. I'm the Secretary General of WILPF. And the background to this is we had intended to have a session at the CSW in March, where we would be discussing how we got to where we were in relation to two slightly different strands of thought that we had anticipated. One was, if you remember, 2020 started rather badly with the assassination of an Iranian general, evil though he had may been. It could have started a conflagration in the Middle East. It didn't happen, but it was pretty close, and it's not over yet. And also the fires that were raging through Australia and the devastation that was causing. So we thought we would actually draw attention to the root causes of both those two scenarios, which essentially we said, going back to what WILPF has been saying since 1915, that it's militarism as a way of thought and an economic system which ensures that there is inequalities between people and between nations. And if you applied that to both those scenarios, you see how we get to the degradation of the environment. So our whole thrust of that meeting was to show how these two systems together inevitably mean the destruction of the planet. That has slightly changed because enter stage right, 2020 being a phenomenal year for bad things happening. The pandemic, which of course is why the CSW was cancelled in the first place, although it hadn't reached the stage of pandemic at that time. So what we want to do today, we still want to stick to the ideas of looking at militarism, looking at the economic systems which have dragged us into the malaise, but maybe shift it a little, because I'm sure most of you will want to talk about the application of those two strands to how we got to this pandemic, and the consequences for that, and then moving forward, because we always want to make sure that having diagnosed the problem, we then find the solutions. So we asked Ray and Nela to continue with their stream of consciousness and their thinking and their analysis to present today. So I'm going to ask Nela to introduce, first of all, her take on the economic systems that have ended up, or that have brought us to where we are now. Nela, all yours.
Yes, okay. Thank you. Also, great to see so many of you here. So I hope my stream of thought is worth your time. Let's see, I think where I want to start is to say that really this is sort of an unprecedented moment we live in, but I think also nothing that we as feminists haven't actually been warning against or warning for, that this is going to happen, that we live in a system that is so deeply unjust and so cruel and so deadly that this, it was inevitable for us to end at this point, at some point in our lifetime. And actually, it has been deadly for so long, for so many people. The difference now is that it's happening sort of simultaneously pretty much across the world. But we often hear in the media these days that sort of we are all in the same boat, and I want us really to deconstruct that, and I want to really make a point that we are actually not all in the same boat. There's actually, we are not even equally sort of contracting the virus. We're not even equal in that, because we literally have people that can self-isolate on their own private islands. They can be flown there by their private planes. And if they by any chance anyway get the virus, they can for sure buy themselves a respirator or 2 or 5, I don't know how many they needed. While at the same time we have countries with millions of people living in those countries that maybe only have 100 respirators or even less for the population. So we are not in the same boat. Today we have, if you have been following the news, there are thousands of migrants in India today, migrant workers in India that have lost their jobs due to pandemic, and that are now also being thrown out by their landlords because they cannot pay their rent. So there's thousands of people on the streets. They cannot go back to their homes, which may be 1,000 kilometers away. For them, it's not the same as for some of us. We have hundreds of thousands of refugees and migrants and asylum seekers in refugee camps that don't even meet the basic minimum of hygiene requirements for them to not only isolate and maintain the distance, but actually maintain the sort of decent levels of hygiene. We have women that are confined to their homes together with abusers. And most probably they will not have anybody to turn to. We have homeless people in Las Vegas that are sleeping now in designated parking lots so that they can maintain the social distance in parking lots. That's quite a lot to take in. We have people that are losing jobs because they are protesting to being forced to work in conditions that don't provide minimum sort of protective measures. People that don't have healthcare insurance so that they can't get treatment if they contract the virus. Not everybody will be, required to provide the same levels of emotional care as that will be needed. And also we have people living in war zones, and this pandemic is sort of yet another danger on top of all the dangers they face every day. So, it's not the same. It's not the same for everybody, and we are not all in the same boat. And I've been thinking when I was preparing for this, sort of, how do we move forward? What do we need to do? And I was thinking that, when you have a disease, a sickness, the first thing, the primary step is to find a diagnosis, to have a proper diagnosis so that you can treat it. And it's not much the same, I think, from the situation we're in today. We need a proper diagnosis as to the challenges we are facing. And I don't think COVID-19 is the right diagnosis, as Madeleine was also saying. I think COVID-19 is a health crisis. Yes, it's a pandemic. It's a major health crisis. But the crisis we are going through as part of that is much bigger than the health crisis. The crisis is structural, and it's very much ideological. And also, if you are like me, privileged enough to be able to sort of spend your time in self-isolation, reading the massive amounts of analysis that are coming out in a few weeks, you will have noticed that there is quite a lot of good analysis coming out, and people are rightly pointing to neoliberalism as the cause for why our countries have been disabled from responding properly to the crisis we are facing. neoliberalism has depleted our public sectors and our public services, but not just of resources, for sure, of resources, but not just of resources. I think also of trust. Trust that not as individuals, but we as a community can and in solidarity with each other respond to the crisis and sort of face the challenges ahead of us. Neoliberalism has turned our education and healthcare systems into profit-driven businesses. So where we sort of go to school, we go to school to meet the market needs, not to sort of to meet the needs of the humankind. Where sort of, you know, maintaining people's health has been about profit. So our healthcare sectors, instead of investing money into preventative healthcare and boosting our immunity, have been, you know, turning towards plastic operations and whatnot, because that's where the profit is. And we live in a system, yes, that hoards profit at the expense of the undervalued and underpaid workforce. That favors profitability of a militarized world over human security and human well-being. And where inequalities are actually fully acceptable. And now we also hoard toilet paper, it seems, and other essential stuff, because that's what we have been taught to do. The greed is okay. It's okay to hoard stuff, and it's okay to only think of yourself. But we also do it, I think, because we don't trust that the governments can get us, that our community and our governments can pull us through this challenge we are facing. I think neoliberalism has really steamrolled over so many of our countries that it's very difficult to imagine, you know, what other world we can have, how we can live differently. Until now, somehow, I think in the midst of this crisis, we don't only see that it is possible to reimagine the world, but we see that it is necessary, because it's becoming a matter of life and death. And what is strongly being revealed by the pandemic, for those that maybe didn't see it before, is the absolute necessity of a public sector, of a strong community to help us all get through this, because individuals cannot respond to the crises such as these. But I want to sort of caution against stopping the diagnosis at neoliberalism. If we only come to the conclusion that the only thing we need to do is get rid of neoliberalism, I think we then have sort of merely been curing the symptoms, but not the disease itself. I think what we need to diagnose is that the capitalism is at the very root cause of the problem. And I think neoliberalism is one of its naughtiest children, but not the only one. But so I think diagnosing properly and seeing that the root causes is capitalism is the beginning of solution to our problems. For capitalism, if we look at it, accumulation of wealth is everything. Inequalities are okay within a capitalist world, because it is within, you know, each individual, according to the philosophy, right, to make a good life for itself. Democracy is a matter of consumption, so on the free market. And since the market is supposedly color and gender blind and incapable of discrimination, our freedoms and our rights and our equalities are also actually a matter of consuming properly on this free market. And that's what sort of capitalism is, and that's what we have been living with. And if neoliberalism is the naughtiest child of capitalism, we also have to sort of then consider what are the other relatives of capitalism. And one of them, a very close one, is patriarchy, with its system of oppression and domination, and where gender determines your place sort of within that system. And it's the combination of the patriarchy and capitalism that has led us to this situation where women take charge of the crisis. It's working in those precarious jobs, the underpaid jobs, who is staying home with our children, etc., etc. And I sort of, you can see this all by yourself. And I think also when we start thinking and imagining the gendered effect of the economic crisis that will come after this, whose jobs are going to disappear, who is going to be asked to fill in when the state fails, who is going to be asked to show solidarity and agree to their wages being cut, and so on and so on. It is the women, it is the underpaid, it is those that have already been exploited for so long. And if we sort of go along this, if you indulge me and go along with this sort of relative line I have. Capitalism has other relatives. Ray will obviously be speaking on militarism, and Cynthia, but let's not forget racism, right? We've seen a lot of it these days, and it's really helpful in thinking about, you know, who is worth saving and who's not, who's worth the healthcare and who's not. So my point is basically our diagnosis have to be comprehensive, and it has to be complete if we really are going to sort of to change our system. And there is this on social media, there is this like a poster or a banner being circulated, which I think is really right to the point. It says, we cannot go back to normal after this. Normal wasn't working. And I think that's it. That's the realization. We cannot go back to the way things were before. And for a very long time, I think we have been presented with this capitalist mantra that, you know, the way we live, the way we organize our societies, the way we deal with each other, the way countries deal with each other, that's the only way that is possible. This sort of survival of the fittest, right? And then there is nothing else. And I find sort of, you know, when we look at also this neoliberalism that has overwhelmed our countries for so long, and some longer than the others, that some of the destruction it has caused, it's literally becoming unbearable. You know, it's difficult to sort of leave that matrix of neoliberalism and think further. And I want towards the end also talk about one of the most hideous effects of neoliberalism, which I find particularly in the country where I come from. And I forgot to introduce myself. I just remembered. I'm based in Bosnia and Herzegovina. My name is Nela, and I live in Bosnia as well. So sorry about that. One of the most hideous things about neoliberalism in Bosnia, but I'm sure we share that with other countries, is this stripping the country away from, and the people in the country from their political sort of sovereignty and autonomy to decide over political and economic decision-making in the country. A lot of the work we do in our context, economic policies are not just difficult, but are also really, really becoming increasingly impossible to question. Things that once were a matter of a public discussion, of a public sort of debates, are now becoming a matter of expertise and a matter of management. So all the language we're using from the business sector. But our societies are really not business projects, nor should they be business projects. The way we sort of organize are essential parts of our societies: our healthcare, our education, our child and elderly care. Our culture is not and should not be a matter of profit, right? And when it becomes a matter of profit, that's when the people disappear from the picture. And I think my point from all this presentation is that we really need to deconstruct this mantra of political and economic policies as something objective and neutral, and that they are equal for everybody. They are not objective, they are not neutral, certainly not in their gendered impact. That these policies, economic and political policies that have been overwhelming us, are sort of results of deliberate policies that are grounded in very sort of particular ideologies. And we might like or dislike those ideologies. Personally, I'm an anti-capitalist. WILPF is an anti-capitalist organization. But some people might disagree. Some might prescribe to the capitalist philosophy. But either way, we need to sort of deconstruct it and make known for what it is. These are political and ideological policies that have led to this crisis where we're facing today, and that will lead to others. This is not sort of the end of it. I'll stop here, Madeleine. I think that's more than enough for me, and then take any follow-up questions you might have. And sorry for forgetting to introduce myself.
I think I should have introduced you, but then, you know, sorry. Thank you, Nela. I mean, that was a bit of a tour de force. If ever, you know, I think that what you've really well illustrated is that the fault lines that have been thrown up as a result of the pandemic, they were already there. All this has done is really done what Cynthia would do, which is really focus the feminist spotlight on those fault lines and how we have to address them going forward. But in order to do that, we need to be able to address neoliberalism. So I want you to answer now, if you can, how does neoliberalism permeate into the systems of economics? How does it actually work?
Yes. So how does it work and how does it enter our, because neoliberalism is sort of, and I hope that came out of has sneaked into sort of every aspect of our lives, right? It's not just an economic policy, it's in our education, it's in the way our systems function. And it has not always been there. It has been introduced to various different mechanisms, and I don't think I can cover them all, so I will try to focus on sort of post-conflict and conflict countries. But before I enter that, I just want to, I'm sure you all sort of know that and aware of this, the Canadian author and activist Naomi Klein, she wrote a couple of years back a book called Shock Doctrine, where she sort of puts a name to some of the mechanisms that are used to enforce neoliberal policies. She calls it disaster capitalism, which is basically about capitalism using momentum of different crises, natural crises or war or whatever crisis a country might face, to push through policies that otherwise would have met resistance, more resistance. Basically, it has happened to US on several occasions. One of them has been in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. She writes quite extensively about it. It has happened to my own country. In the midst of war, the government was imposing or sort of adopting new laws that would enable full-on privatization after the war. It has happened to Chile, it has happened to Lebanon, and it for sure will be happening now. Some of the countries in Latin America have been under the neoliberal boot for quite a long time, being the laboratories of this ideology, unfortunately. But if we look at sort of how neoliberalism sneaks itself into our lives in conflict and post-conflict countries, if you don't mind, Madeleine, me focusing on that. Because sometimes, like in functional democracies, people make deliberate choices. They vote for the candidate, and some of those candidates are sort of prescribing neoliberal policies, and people that vote for them do that consciously. They either prescribe it or they don't understand it fully, whatever motivation they might have. They give their vote for such policies. But in post-conflict context, I think it's rarely a matter of political choices. What actually happens is that these neoliberal policies come as a package, as peace-building package, right? And they are often imposed by international financial institutions that take a very active role in post-conflict reconstruction and recovery. And how the door is opened for them is basically through this liberal understanding of peace building, where sort of the understanding is, very simply explained, is that the best framework, the best environment for peace is a free market, is a market economy that is then supported by so-called free elections or limited government interference, rule of law, etc. So if we look at what neoliberalism, very sort of shortly explained, is about, it, to greatest extent, it's about shifting the focus from supporting local and domestic markets and industries to sort of shifting the countries to be export-oriented strategies or markets for private and most often foreign investments. And what needs to happen in order to create this environment is basically reduction in public spending and government control. And often this is introduced by, for example, saying, we need to increase efficiency, we need to step up the creditworthiness of the country. What also needs to happen is the labor market to be deregulated, so lower wages or less labor rights protection so that we attract the investments. We also need massive privatization, again, because of inefficiency arguments. And usually sort of how they can impose these policies is if we consider that countries coming out of conflict or any type of crisis usually need money. It's rarely that countries are so affluent that they can sort of fix the crisis coming out of from the conflict on their own. So they need to borrow money. The global system functions like the only available money is from the financial, not only available, but that's how the system works, international financial institutions. And when you borrow money or even grants, sometimes they give grants, it's not always loans, they come with conditionalities. And these conditionalities are the way sort of how policies that deplete our public sectors are introduced. Because again, we need to contract fiscal spending, which means we spend less from the public budgets. So we deplete the public sectors. We want to privatize much more because the public sector, again, is supposedly inefficient. So it's through the conditionalities we have seen the greatest sort of, or the biggest Trojan horse, if you wish, of how they enter. And then it becomes sort of a mantra. And again, I want to go back to this presentation of these policies as something neutral and objective. In my country, I think any discussion on the economic interventions in the country have been completely depoliticized. We don't get to discuss conditionalities. We don't get to participate in government decisions whether we should or need to borrow the money. Maybe there is money elsewhere we could tap into. We don't get to discuss how the conditionalities look like. We don't get to choose that, to participate in that sort of decision making. Everything is served as a matter of objectivity and neutrality, and there's sort of no other way around it. Yeah.
Thanks. And I think, can we put a flag here? Because we really need to look at what the solutions are going to be. But I know from watching what the World Bank is saying, but particularly what seems to be going on with the IMF now, we have got to be very, very cognizant of the fact that there will be loans from the IMF to countries as a result of the pandemic, which could actually shrink the support for healthcare and education and welfare and worker support and all the things that are really important, and certainly on a matter of human rights, that could shrink it even more and make the system work. So what we've got to do is to focus very much on creating that alternative and making sure we block somehow, somewhere, and we're going to be discussing this, what we do to find alternatives to that model. I want to bring in Ray. Oh, can I come back to that in a minute?
It's just very related to what you just said. It's very short.
Okay, quick.
Yeah, so there's already 85 countries lined up. That's what's on the World Bank website, lined up for new loans. And there's a lot of happening. So yeah, that's a very sort of very big red flag we're raising there.
Very, very, very big. Thank you. Ray, can I bring you in now? Ray Acheson, Director of Reaching Critical Will. I did remember to introduce you. Ray, yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Madeleine. Yes, I'm the director of WILPF's disarmament program, Reaching Critical Will. I'm based in New York, and I'm a Canadian and Irish citizen. And just to add to the internationality of this call, which is really great to see everybody in the chat box and the comments so far and things like that. I'm going to pick up from Nela and focus on militarism issues and looking at sort of how our investments of militarism have gotten us to this point, but also looking ahead to what are the actions that we can be taking right now from our homes while we're in this situation in order to build upon in the future. And so I wanted to start actually with WILPF's history in 1915 when we were founded, and our very first resolution from the women that came together during World War I, they located the main problem, the main hindrance to peace in the great armament factories of the world that were reaping profits from war. And so WILPF has always located throughout our history the main problem or impediment to peace and to equality within war and within the production and sale and profiting from weapons. In today's world, of course, as you all probably know, military spending globally is at almost $2 trillion worldwide. And that doesn't even capture all the different elements of militarism. That is what SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, has been able to calculate. And there's more and more money budgeted all the time. We're seeing budgets in Europe, in the US, in the Middle East go up, devoting more and more money to soldiers and weapons and new technologies of violence. The arms trade is a huge source of profiteering for private interests, corporations, for governments, and it leads to a lot of the problems that we're seeing today. You know, the destruction of the environment, migration and displacement, the use of explosive weapons, in particular bombing in towns and cities that we're seeing more and more of all the time now. It's destroying lives, destroying civilian infrastructure, has many long-term health effects, and including in this moment to focus on healthcare and hospitals. For example, in Syria and Yemen, the bombings of hospitals and of other medical facilities has been a direct target. And there have been in Yemen, for example, over 130 attacks on medical facilities since the Saudi-led bombing campaign began in 2015. And since last year, at least 60 healthcare facilities in northwestern Syria have been damaged in airstrikes as well. So we can see directly the impact this has on situations now in terms of what Nela was speaking about, that people are experiencing this differently. The situation is very grave in these contexts where weapons have been sold and used in these situations. And beyond that, of course, as many of you know, a big aspect of Reaching Critical Will's work has been on nuclear weapons, which is, you know, a weapon that contains the ultimate capacity for violence, from the mining of uranium through to the testing, through to the use and the storage of radioactive waste afterwards. The entire chain of nuclear weapons is destructive for our environment, for people living in the land, and for our water. There's been studies around the effects that the use of a single nuclear weapon or a few nuclear weapons would have to exacerbate climate change, to create global famine, and to destroy, again, of course, all of the infrastructure that we have. If you can imagine, you know, in this context where we're living right now, adding this type of violence into the situation would completely overwhelm any of our abilities to access healthcare or hospitals. But nuclear weapons are also what Arundhati Roy calls the ultimate colonizer. They've colonized our minds, this idea that they are the weapons that will provide us with security, that they are the weapons that will protect us from destruction or attack from someone else, that they're part of this patriarchal racist system that Nela was describing, in terms of oppression and ruling through the strength of force, of overwhelming force. And they're also a great capitalist tool. They absorb trillions of dollars. The companies that make these weapons live off of the cost overruns. It's an incredible system of how to make money on these weapons that you know, are supposedly designed to never actually be used. So it's a good game that's being run there. And they're certainly not the only weapons that create profit. We're seeing now investments in newer ways to kill each other, new designs to ensure that the using force is safely tucked away, whether it's armed drones and the pilots are half a world away, or whether it's now autonomous weapons that certain countries are seeking to develop, where they wouldn't even have a human being operating them. They would be deployed and would be making their own decisions, so to speak, about what the appropriate target is and when to fire upon that target. This is where our money is going. This is where our human ingenuity is going. It's going into ways to kill each other. It's going into developing new technologies of violence rather than of technologies that would actually help us to survive our world that we have created and to even thrive in it on a more equitable basis. We're a world that is equipped to fight wars, not pandemics. And having invested so much for so long, financially and intellectually, in militarized security and this concept that we need militaries, we need militarism, we need weapons in order to be secure, now we're facing the situation where it becomes the answer to every perceived or actual threat. And the turn to militarism in situations like this one escalates what levels of militarism we're going to be willing to accept in our lives after it's over. So what becomes the new normal after this crisis has passed? And also the militarism that we see now and that we will see later exacerbates the racism, the xenophobia, and this insider-outsider mentality. The vast economic investments in militarism have always relied on tensions between communities and groups. And in a time of crisis, these are very easy tropes to fall back on and to reinvest in, or even to create anew. And so instead of militarism, we need redirection of funds to social and environmental well-being. I think this is well established, but we also need a radical reimagining of our security infrastructure and our ideas about what security means to us, whose security matters, and how we reach that. And so this is why WILPF is supporting the recent call of the UN Secretary General for a global ceasefire. He put this out last week, asking everyone in the world to lay down their weapons during this crisis. And we think that is obviously a great idea. But a temporary ceasefire is not enough. Making that ceasefire permanent will be important, but also the companies that make the weapons that are used in conflict, the governments that approve the arms sales and the arms transfers, the brokers that facilitate these arms deals, all of these aspects of the system of militarism are also responsible for the violence and then responsible for a ceasefire. And so while soldiers and militants have to lay down their weapons, yes, others must also stop providing them. But right now, most arms companies are open for business. And some governments have declared them to be essential services that need to remain open during this crisis. In addition to that, US Strategic Command has said that it's confident that it will be able to keep production related to the modernization of its nuclear forces on track, and that the coronavirus has had no impact on its ability to launch its nuclear weapons. So I hope you all feel really safe about that. The US can still launch nuclear bombs while we're all sheltering in our homes from the virus. But if these are considered essential services, then we're saying that it's worth risking the health of workers in these factories, in the arms factories, at transshipment sites, at gun stores in the United States, which some of them are trying to be declared essential services as well. We're also saying that it's important that we keep spreading arms and ammunition in this time of fear and uncertainty. And we're saying that, as the war profiteers always have, that the revenues of war are more valuable than human life. And we're also saying that this militarized, weaponized conception of security is all that we can imagine for our world. So how can we push back on this? WILPF's been thinking a little bit about actions that folks can take from home now, and that we really need to build upon throughout this period and beyond, of course, as well. So some targeted activities and asks and demands that we can make. We can call on arms companies to shut down during the pandemic. The Italian Disarmament Network has been doing this in Italy, calling on closure of arms factories, many of which are actually run by US companies in Italy, such as Lockheed Martin. We can also urge that these factories and the workers are producing essential medical equipment instead of weapons during this time. We can also demand divestment from these companies. We already have actions through Code Pink and Don't Bank on the Bomb to ask for our pension funds or our banks to take money away from bomb manufacturers, nuclear weapon manufacturers. And there's been other excellent divestment campaigns over the years. One that Madeleine pointed out recently was that last year, Norway's investment companies and also its largest pension fund moved to divest from any of the firms that were involved in the deliberate deforestation of the Amazon. So in times of emergency, it's a great opportunity to draw attention to the destruction that these companies are doing and to act against them. We can also demand that our governments redirect public resources from weapons and war towards the production of medical equipment, medical staff, as well as the provision of wages, rents, food, and healthcare of those suffering from the economic impacts of the coronavirus. And like Nela was saying, building a political economy that's based on solidarity, care, and compassion, that's imperative to surviving this crisis and whatever comes next. In terms of disarmament and some of the campaigns and coalitions that some of you on this call may be used to working on with WILPF, we can focus on this this idea that nuclear weapons are somehow still essential during this crisis, and we can use it to ramp up efforts to have countries sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons to totally reject these weapons. It is still possible to ratify this treaty during the crisis. The UN has set up a system for virtual ratification, and Namibia did it, the government of Namibia did it just last week. So it is still absolutely possible. It's also still possible to ask our cities to join the ICANN Cities Appeal and all of the other campaigns that we have ongoing. There's also right now in Geneva, led by the Irish government, a campaign to get countries to commit to stop using explosive weapons in populated areas, to stop bombing towns and cities the way that we've seen going on in Yemen and Syria and Iraq and so many other places. And so that process is still continuing virtually while everything is in shutdown. So having our input into that process, making sure that's a strong tool coming out of this crisis, is really important. Military exercises are another big thing, that there's already online campaigns to call to shut down these joint military exercises that happen all the time. So the coronavirus has led to a postponement of many of them because of the concerns of shipping soldiers around the world, having them mingle to do these exercises. So the US and the Republic of Korea have already postponed theirs. NATO has postponed its cold response joint exercise in Norway. And activists right now have a coalition to cancel the Rim of the Pacific naval war exercise. So this is something that we can work on now, using this, this moment to call for their postponement. But then really these exercises need to end, because these types of joint trainings lead to the preparation for war. They heighten regional and global tensions, and they reinforce this militarist mindset that undermines peace, cooperation, and solidarity that we really desperately need. So I'm going to end here, but I just wanted to close with that, to reinforce this plea that we really try and think beyond what it is that we've been taught is essential, whether that's essential for our security, for our economy, for our daily lives. Rethinking that is what is necessary now, and this moment provides us with a new perspective. And I think that if we don't do that, we're not only going to fail to implement, say, the global ceasefire or other necessary emergency measures that we need right now, but we're just going to continue to invest our precious resources in new ways to kill each other rather than in ways to live together on a healthier planet. Thanks.
Thanks, Ray. I think very tangible calls there as to what we can be doing. Plus, I think, to reiterate what you're saying, this does give us an opportunity, because now people are really staring in the face the cost of militarism compared to, 100 to 250,000 people are estimated to go and die in the United States as a result of the lack of preparedness, lack of healthcare, lack of access to the right sort of treatment. And instead, you've still got the nuclear weapon that's going to protect all the Americans. That works. There's been some really good stuff in the chat box, and there's one particularly that came from Manuela, which I thought I'd put to Cynthia, actually, to Cynthia Enlow, who was on the call, because she was asking how to address the pandemic when it is actually spoken of as a war and the need to avert a military approach to dealing with the virus. So Cynthia, can I call you in now?
Yes, hi Madeleine. Hi all 126 co-conversationalists. It's great to be with you all. Just a quick note for those of you who found yourselves taking notes like mad while Ray and Nela were speaking, go on to the WILPF website and you can see both the Spanish WILPFers' wonderful essay and also essays by Ray and Nela, and you can take your time and print them out and share them with others. So that's the first thing. I just found myself my mind was racing as both Nela and Ray were speaking so wonderfully. I think, Madeleine, one of the things that I've noticed that I'm sure everybody in the chat room or people who would like to join the chat can give their own examples, and it would be great to see everybody's examples from their own place. I'm here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the US, and that is the insidiousness, and Nela referred to this and so did Ray, the insidiousness of a masculinized kind of militarized authority, as well as the sense that war is, and this is the Spanish WILPFers breakthrough, I thought, that war is our only imaginary, that when we try to think of solidarity, when we try to think of pulling together, when we try to think of building community in a time of a health crisis, not anyone on this call, I bet, but so many of the people that we're in conversation with or we listen to, the only thing they can think of is wartime. And they imagine that war was the time when we were, as Nela demystified, all in the same boat. And war never puts us all in the same boat. The worst thing is, though, that war, well, not the worst, but one of the key requirements for that war waging analogy to seem reasonable is that it masculinizes authority. Who to trust as authoritative, whose leadership is, quote, real leadership. So nurses are being celebrated. Healthcare workers, both women and men, who are low-paid hospital workers or are paramedics rushing to homes with their gurneys to get people to non-existent ventilators, they're being treated as heroes, but they're not being treated as nurses. Nurses are not the ones who can issue new laws. Nurses are not the ones who are being put on television to tell us how reality is playing out, what, as Nela said, has been defunded for years. Nurses are not, that is the most feminized, and certainly not all nurses are women, we know that, but a great majority are. Something like 2/3 of all healthcare professionals, people being paid to do healthcare work, are women. And so I think that there is this sense that you masculinize authority, you masculinize your go-to analogy, war waging, you masculinize our minds. And a woman's mind can be masculinized insofar as she thinks that men are the most trustworthy leaders and or scientific authorities. That's how you masculinize your own imagination, no matter if you're a woman, a man, or non-binary. And that's how you treat a pandemic. So I think one of the wonderful things about this whole network of 125 of us and all our feminist friends and allies who couldn't be on the call, I think one of the great things we bring to this is a really different notion of who to trust for authoritative knowledge, who is best able to galvanize us in a way, as Ray put, so that after the pandemic, we have in place a more sustainable, genuinely security producing sense and practice of community. That's what feminists have been working on. WILPFers and all the friends of WILPF. That is that we use feminist analysis to demystify, debunk, and show the masculinized emperor has no clothes when it comes to genuine security, sustainable community, and real peace that involves healthy communities. So you can't do the work we're all trying to do, I think, unless we all use our feminist imaginations, our feminist language, our feminist solution building, and our feminist ways of cooperating with each other, which have nothing to do with war waging.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm seeing in the chat box that there's a lot of recognition of how various countries, South Africa, France, all, I don't know, Liat, where you are, but very much a whole big thing on how the military and the police are being utilized to basically to monitor and control the freedom of movement of individuals. Not that we're saying that people should be wandering around the streets right now, of course not, on the contrary, but what is the best way of doing that? Cynthia,
yeah, I'm happy to hear all of that from all the good authoritative people observing what's going on in their country and telling us on the chat room. And that is, this is the moment. This is just like Fukushima in the crisis after the tsunami in Japan. You have to beware when militaries, and Ray, I'm sure, has many examples of this, when militaries, state militaries now we're talking about, and militarized police forces, when they try to present themselves as the healthcare workers of their country. They try to present themselves as really, here is who you can trust. And that means that after the pandemic, that state military and that array of militarized police forces come out smelling, if you will, like roses, which then further deepens the legitimation of those state actors, not the nurses, not the paramedics, not the low-paid hospital cleaners, but the militaries come out as the heroes to be remembered. And if the militaries are allowed to clean up their act in the public mind, that's your and my mind, then in fact, the end of the pandemic will be a deepening of a masculinized form of militarism, which distorts genuine security. So yes, it's good if soldiers take off their camouflage and are just in their khaki t-shirts building hospital cubicles in the sports arena. That's a good use. But then the lesson should be, we don't need militaries. What we need are genuine security. And we wouldn't call them forces. We would call them services. That's what we need. And that's the lesson. Disband militaries and create real, meaning trained. All these soldiers aren't trained for public health. Really trained, equipped, genuine, popular, community building, sustainable peace services. Beware militaries when they try to clean up their acts in the middle of a natural disaster or a health crisis. Beware, beware, beware.
Wise words, thank you. And I just really, again like to draw attention to the really excellent piece that was produced by WILPF Spain on exactly that, the way in which the militarization of the efforts being made, the incredible efforts being done by the health service, and giving the military honorings, if you like, which is completely antithesis of where we should be going. A lot of stuff in the chat room, all agreeing that this is what needs to be done. And the question from Nela again is how to reframe the situation to give visibility to the resilience of the society. Nela or Ray, do you want to come back in on this, or shall we open it up a little more? Because I would like to add that I think one of the things that I find really one of the greatest shams, if you like, is this way in which it's our taxpayers' money which go to pay for the militaries, and our taxpayers' dollars which are actually diverted from where we would want them to go to pay for decent healthcare, public health, all the things that we have been discussing. And yet, when it's given back to us in the shape of the military, we're supposed to be extraordinarily grateful to their generosity and their sacrifice, when in fact, we bought their hours anyway. We had to pay for them, and we wouldn't want them to be doing this sort of work. Why is it we're not allocating, instead of what Ray was and Cynthia both saying, the money that goes to the military should have been used to create a public health system that was not for profit, but was for the many. This is so obvious, and this is coming up again and again. Now, how do we get this message out? We need to be thinking, I think, creatively about how we're using our existing systems. And I want to come on to discuss that a little more, because WILPF, as you know, has always been supportive of a multilateral system which would prevent conflict. Now, are we using the system? Is that system now being responsive to what we're saying? Or on the contrary, is it going another direction? Good sides and bad sides? What do you think?
Who are you asking, Madeleine?
Well, I asked you and Nela if you wanted to come back first. It was silent, but please, Ray, jump in.
Okay, sorry, just had a little mute issue there, as we do with this technology, which is why we shouldn't make it more violent. Yeah, I think I was just also trying to catch up and read what was in the chat box, because it's been continuously flowing, which is great. And I think a lot of this conversation is really, does really get, I think, to what Cynthia was saying as well about the military being brought forward as heroes. And so this idea of how we articulate an alternative narrative to that is, I think, really going to be really crucial in this moment and beyond. And right now we're seeing all this celebration, of course, like Cynthia was saying, and you were saying about, you know, the healthcare workers and the workers in factories that are delivering goods and the drivers, etc. And I think there's going to need to be not just a reinvestment in the healthcare sector once this is over, and a reckoning with the neoliberal policies that have trashed the healthcare sector, but we're also going to need to address how we pay and provide benefits for and provide safety net for all of these other workers in the system that we now, you know, that some of us have always understood are the essential workers, but the sort of global meta narrative has always diminished in terms of who's important and who's not. So I think we do need to expand that celebration beyond just the healthcare sector and to looking at everything that is working these days. But I also think that, you know, I become wary of talking about focusing on local things, because I think it can be misinterpreted as this turn inward and protect yourselves or your neighbors or your community or whoever you identify with locally. But I do think that it's important to talk about the local and the ways in which we might be community building right now in terms of sharing resources with people in our apartment buildings or our neighborhoods. And getting groceries for each other and things like that. Or if you're lucky enough to live in a slightly more rural area and you have land where you're growing food with people collectively, perhaps. I think all of these things are going to be very essential to hold on to beyond this crisis, but to think about how the local connects to the global as well. I think about that in terms of militarism as well, of course, in the campaigns that we work on, and things like banning nuclear weapons globally and then asking local city councils to support this international treaty, or getting local municipalities to divest their funds from these weapons because they've been banned globally. And I think there's all kinds of local global models. WILPF itself is one where we try very hard to connect our local and national sections and members to what's going on at the UN and vice versa, to try and increase relevance and resilience and knowledge as well. And that's what's great about this chat that's happening, which has now become impossible to keep up with, because we're hearing so much of what's happening in local experiences. And so sharing that information and highlighting that amongst ourselves and building up these networks is imperative to creating more visibility of solidarity over fear and uncertainty or racism and xenophobia that we can see if we just maybe check in with Twitter once a day and then close it immediately because it's too scary.
Thanks, Ray. And I'm trying to keep up with all the chats as well. Several strands coming up. One is that we must not lose this environmental link. And I think that's fundamentally important, because we can talk a little bit shortly on disaster capitalism and what is happening, because whilst we're all focusing on the pandemic, all sorts of evil things are being allowed to happen, which lead to further degradation of the environment. And I know a lot of the environmental organizations are really worried about the sustainability of their funding, because everything is now going into this, coping with this the disaster we're facing now, rather than thinking long-term and having long-term planning for what should happen. The good news is, of course, that maybe this will be a real spur to actually change the way in which we have all conducted our businesses before, with reduction in travel, reduction in certainly the number of cruise liners who's going to get on a boat anytime soon. Which is actually amazing how quickly that recovery can be made if we control the economic impetuses towards the restoration of the military-industrial complex as it existed before. Now, the strands I wanted to look at that have come up very much, obviously, under the two headings, if you like, of capitalism, particularly neoliberalism, and the militarized the whole rise of militarism. We've got to deal with both of those chunks. But underneath those, we've got the concept that we've got to look at disaster capitalism, what is actually happening now, and what steps could be done to ameliorate, to stop, and to draw attention to that. That's huge. We've also got how we can engage with the international system so that we're pushing them in the right direction. We've got what's happening not just as a result of disaster capitalism, that's the economic wing, but we also have what's going on in conflicts, where we've actually seen, instead of respecting ceasefires in countries like Yemen, they've used distraction by, because everyone's distracted by the pandemic, to actually do increased attacks on each other, particularly from the Hutu side, who attacked Riyadh the other day. So there's I'm reading about Ethiopia again, destabilization going on because there's now possibilities of using the opportunities that distraction has actually created. So I think what we want to be looking at is the bad things, the disaster capitalism, the abuse of power, and the, again, hiding from international scrutiny so in order to get away with things that they wouldn't have got away with before. That's the dark side. The lighter side is what Ray was talking about, the international solidarity, but community-based solidarity as well. And then this actual elevation, as is coming up in the chat box all the time, all over the world, people are thinking along similar lines, that we really have to reframe the way in which the world has worked. And we've got those. If we're reframing the world through a different lens, how do we actually make sure that we can use that multilateral system to actually ensure the sustainability of it? So what is it we need to be doing? What is it we need to be pushing? And I can see that Cynthia has indicated she wants to speak. Cynthia, come in.
Yeah, just quickly to underscore and put in neon what you and Ray and Nela and many of the good chat people have been saying. Here's a feminist lesson. And it's a feminist lesson many of us have had to absorb and learn from others. Beware the patriarchal wielding of urgency. Urgency becomes the camouflage for sustaining patriarchal ways of doing things. So how many, and all of us can use the examples from so many different countries, how many people have learned that every time feminists raise an issue in the middle of a war or a revolutionary insurgency, that the people invested in the sustaining of patriarchy say to the women, dear, always dear, meaning you're naive, dear, things are too urgent now, later we will build community, later we'll address domestic violence, later we will think about healthcare, later we will treat nurses as authorities, later. And then later, of course, never comes, because in the meantime, between the urgent now and the time when finally feminists questions are given a nod, patriarchy is deeper than ever, militarism is more widespread than ever. So I think one of the challenges to us as activist thinkers now, activists and thinkers, you can't be an activist unless you're a thinker anyway. So activist thinkers is how to both address pertinent, relevant needs right now in a way that builds a feminist later. So that the urgency and the later are not seen as rivals, but how you address the urgent now is a building block for creating a feminist informed, genuine security later.
Answers on a postcard. That's, how do we do this? How do we actually make sure there is a continuum between the need for urgent action, which is not patriarchal, non-militarized, to a strategy which is in there for the long haul?
We do exactly what all the people in the chat room and Ray and Nela and you have been saying visually, that is, we share. I mean, I've learned so much in the last month about creativity I couldn't even dream of, but it's because people are sharing it. And I think the sharing and the building lessons as we share is the way to make the urgent response be a positive feminist informed building block for the creative piece of later. That is, share, but draw lessons. Actually, lessons are really important. Patriarchal militarists are always doing lessons. And let's make sure we put out what is this lesson, what is that lesson, and what's the next lesson? What are lessons? And call them that, build them, make them explicit, make them public, and share them. That would be my tiny.
That's not tiny, that's big. Actually, can I do this now? Because I think it would be very helpful if we ground some some real potential solutions into this. And there's a very good, it's gone off the screen now, but there was a very good one intervention from Claire Duncanson about the IFIs, given the numbers that of states that are going to go running off to try and get loans from the IFIs, which is perpetuating the system. Nela, are you able to hear us?
Yes, sometimes you disappear, or rather there's like a glitch in it, but most of the thing I do hear, yeah.
Because what I think would be really interesting, if you could just say, just very briefly, the way in which, to expand a little on what you said before, about the way in which the conditionalities that are put really hit on specific countries, because you've done a lot of work on Ukraine, a lot of work on Bosnia in particular. Because then I wanted to be able to look at what we could be arguing for in terms of as a matter of law as a way, and using the multilateral system to offset some of that. So we identify in some detail the problem, and then what are the solutions and who can we hold accountable for making those changes? Because you spoke in the first place about the people in Bosnia not having been consulted at all around the World Bank loan, and thence the IMF loan, nor the economic reform agenda. Could you just speak very briefly to that?
Yeah, so I can try to be super brief, and I'll use the example of Bosnia because that's the closest to me. Basically, for a while, for the first 10 years since the war in Bosnia, since the end of the war in Bosnia, there wasn't any greater push for Bosnia to lend the money and to borrow money from international financial institutions. And there was even ministers saying, because of all the other money that was coming in through donations and everything that was happening, Bosnia could actually, through a smart economics, could have, created an economy that was functional. But at some point, there was a decision made, and without sounding too conspiracy theory, I don't want to sound at all, but there was this idea that we need to start borrowing money. And with the idea of start borrowing money came also, and I really want to say overnight, an idea that we have to reform our economic system. And it was introduced to us through a so-called reform agenda. And literally, This came in overnight, and it was introduced to us as a response to a very big public social protests that were going on, where people were calling for end of corruption, end of war profiteering, a rule of law, in a sense that there was equality in law for everybody, not just a law for the ruling elite, and the rest can people can do with you whatever they want. There came a response from European Union, and I really want to highlight the role of European Union here, and I realize it's different depending on which country you come from. For us, European Union, in terms of holding accountable, is really key here, because they introduced, together with our government, they presented to us this reform agenda, which was introduced and combined as part of Bosnia's pre-accession to the European Union, because this is apparently one political thing that everybody agrees on in this country. And this reform agenda was very clearly based on a set of neoliberal policies. So basically fiscal consolidation, a small public sector, big private sector, flexibilization of the labor laws, public-private partnership. I mean, it's the similar package where they use everywhere, but through Bosnia, it came through this reform agenda. So it was put together with European accession, and then World Bank, International Monetary Fund, together with the EBRD and EIB, the European banks, basically said, we will lend you the money and sometimes also grant you the money to do some of these projects. Part of, for example, of the big part of the reform agenda have also been big infrastructural projects that have been hugely gendered, in a sense. They are introduced to us as job-creating projects, but are basically heavily male-based infrastructural projects. So we have been borrowing insane amount of money, and I've been trying to track the exact amounts into building, for example, highways that are so expensive for Bosnians to ride on, instead of putting money into our public healthcare sector. Our public healthcare sector was completely depleted even before this crisis, and now it's really, this is why I said it doesn't matter in the beginning if you live, if you live in Germany and facing this crisis, or if you live in Bosnia, our public healthcare sector is not capable of handling this crisis. And part of the reasons why it's not capable of handling it is because it was decided that great vast of investment money go into, let's say, the construction of highways instead of public healthcare sector. And if you think about it, when you have a country coming out of war, public healthcare sector must be one of the key sectors that you do want to invest in. This is the sector that will make the public, not just in terms of healing the wounds from the war, but basically enabling the population to start working, to be healthy, to then be able to contribute to sort of economic development in your country. Instead, sort of that was left aside. What we focused on was infrastructural projects, energy sector, etc. So I don't know if that is answering your question in a short way, but what I'm trying to highlight is that decisions were made through this reform agenda that was highly driven by European Union and very supported by international financial institutions that went into a completely different direction than from where the Bosnian society was trying to sort of center its needs, such as transparency, democracy, healthcare sector, education, etc. Very shortly, happy to take follow-up questions if you think I wasn't clear enough.
No, thanks, that was really clear. The reason I asked that, because to follow up to what Cynthia was saying about sharing, because that information is fundamentally important to think of what may be coming if there are IMF and World Bank loans done in similar fashion, so that we are aware of what needs to be done to prevent that. Now, one of the things that did not happen in the Bosnia case is that nobody saw who was accountable. If you think of the violation of human rights, which actually result because of this, the way in which they implemented the austerity programs in Bosnia and elsewhere, not the state, not the IMF, not the World Bank, none of them had any legal accountability whatsoever. And if you are interested, on the website, there is an analysis that we have done on that as to see what the legal obligations should be. And I really challenge us to not forget how we should be using law. And if you think, just as a simple example, on the IMF board, there are many of the countries from which you are you're speaking from now. Sweden has a major role, and they are, ostensibly having a feminist foreign policy. We need the boards of those countries to actually be directing the loans, the way in which the loans are done, so that they have a human rights focus and they actually address the gendered inequalities which are resulting as a result even deeper now because of the pandemic. So I think those are the things we need to be doing, because we have ignored the IFI system for far too long as feminists, because we don't feel we have been excluded from it. There is insufficient scrutiny, and yet now this is going to be the new big development, one of the new big developments I think we can predict as a result of the pandemic. So that's one. I think it's a very clear, strong intervention that we should, as feminists now, be organizing ourselves to make, and monitoring it through the human rights system. Just to say that Nela and other people in WILPF, with contributions from us, will be with the contribution from our sections mainly, but from others. Everyone's happy for you to give their contributions. We're drawing up what we think is going to be like a guidance for the things that we need to be looking to address. So monitoring exactly what I've just been talking about and what Nela and Ray and Cynthia have described. What is it that we need to be monitoring? What it is we need to be responding to, how to respond, and where. So that's one for the IFIs, that's one for the militarization. How and in what ways are we sharing this information that Cynthia mentioned, and what responses can we share? And then we go back to what Ray was talking about. Much of it will be experienced at a very local level. So how can we organize locally to make sure that we are understanding why it is that people are not accessing healthcare, not getting the food supplies they need, that some incarcerations are closer and more difficult than in others, and not forgetting at all to monitor what is happening under the guise of the pandemic to the environment. On that note, can I just very quickly bring in Ray, because there's some classic examples of disaster capitalism and environmental degradation that have come out of Canada, which I think, again, we should interrogate this and see what we could be doing now in response to such activities. Ray, can you just speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So there are a few Canadians on the call, but just for those who may not be familiar, before this current crisis started, Canada was actually in a different kind of lockdown, if you will. There was actions called Shut Down Canada that had spread across the country, that were sparked by the most recent incursion of the Canadian settler state into Indigenous territory in the pursuit of creating yet another pipeline. This was a natural gas pipeline that a company called TC Energy wanted to build on Wet'suwet'en land in British Columbia. And this is unceded territory in British Columbia. And the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had been deployed to shut down the blockade, the camp that the Wet'suwet'en had set up. In response to that, other Indigenous groups across Canada set up blockades at different points. So Mohawk in Ontario and Quebec actually blocked the main train lines between Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. And there were other blockades across the country in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And there was an Indigenous youth brigade that staged a sit-in at the British Columbia provincial government. And yeah, there was a lot of solidarity actions as well by others across the country. And so we were already in that zone before this started. And it took a few months, but the British Columbian and federal government finally started to talk to the Wet'suwet'en, which was their main demand, that we sit down and have negotiations over this. Because Trudeau was starting to ramp up the sort of militarized reaction, threatening to shut down the barricades. The RCMP, The Guardian, leaked some internal documents of the RCMP where they were authorized to use force to remove the Wet'suwet'en from their own land. And so negotiations were starting, but then coronavirus started. So the agreements that were being formulated were all put sort of on hold. Now, in the this current situation, whilst other things have been shut down in Canada, and there is, work from home policies and social distance policies, etc., all being implemented, TC Energy has announced that it is going forward with construction of the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And so the quote-unquote man camps, which house lots of workers together in close quarters, are still in action, and they are being deployed to continue construction during this crisis on Indigenous lands, thus of course also risking the First Nations populations that live on the land. And so it is a classic example, I think, of disaster capitalism. The Trudeau government's sort of emergency relief policies have they've had some good elements, not infallible, not without their flaws, but comparatively sitting in the United States looks pretty good. But on the same hand, Trudeau is also looking to bail out the oil and gas companies. The province of Alberta has just announced that it's going to invest in a different TC Energy project, the Keystone XL pipeline, which will go from the Alberta tar sands down to the Gulf Coast. And so these projects are being rammed through in this moment of crisis over the consistent and resilient objections of Indigenous populations and environmentalists in Canada and in the United States. And so remaining vigilant about these projects, sharing this information, acting in solidarity with those who are on the front lines of defense, trying to blockade these projects with their bodies at a time that we need to be keeping our bodies inside and away from each other. It's just an added layer of extreme assault from the state and from these corporations that we really need to be paying attention to and trying to prevent in all of the ways possible while we're stuck behind our computers basically at home.
Thank you, Ray. Very depressing, but I think an extremely good example of disaster capitalism taking advantage of the situation and then exacerbating environmental degradation while they think we're all wearing our pajamas. No, I think what you've just said, let's show the solidarity, that people share this information so that it's, and provide that support for those who are actually seeking to prevent such actions. We must call the governments out that are enabling this to happen. Can I push us on a little bit, because I'm conscious that time is really running, and I wanted us to look a little bit more at the chat box is now full of WPS questions, which I think is very good point. And just to direct us back to what Ray was talking about at the beginning, which is the call for ceasefires. Because if we're actually looking at the ways very articulately done already, the ways in which it impacts in the pandemic could impact in already disastrous situations is going to be enormous. WILPF has endorsed, or has definitely supported and taken further, the call for a ceasefire. But the question is, what? There's no question that the Security Council is going to pass a resolution. Estonia tried to get them to pass a resolution calling the pandemic a threat to international peace and security, and that would have enabled comprehensive global action to tackle it. That was the idea. Russia, the United States, and China opposed. And so that's not going to go anywhere. What is needed really is the ceasefires to actually be implemented in ways that are going to work for us. Now, just saying, 53 states have endorsed the call for a ceasefire, saying they will support it. The European Union has as a bloc. The United Kingdom is going to, apparently, so that's 2 out of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. But I mean, this is a personal opinion, but I know Rees shares it. Do we want a Security Council resolution in any case? Because if they do, it's all going to be about counterterrorism, no doubt, and a militaristic response to the pandemic. Or do we want to do things differently? And one thought we are having now is that if we're calling for ceasefires, the Security Council won't entertain it. The General Assembly is going to discuss it, and it is in process. There may well be some sort of a General Assembly resolution. But we also have the regional bodies. And the regional bodies are the ones closest to the ground where ceasefires need to be implemented. But if they do that, what are we looking at from a women, peace and security perspective? Surely what we must be doing is exactly what we would always do. We're calling for a ceasefire. We want to make that permanent. So we actually have to implement what the Women, Peace and Security agenda has been saying from the very, very beginning, which means that we must make sure that the women on the ground are the ones who are designing the way in which a ceasefire must take place. That when it comes to the humanitarian space, which is then going to be occupied, they're the ones who know what is happening. They know what is needed. So how do we make sure that what their participation is actually worked, what is actually utilized as the basis for the design of humanitarian support and action, and then the type of support and action. So what are women saying about the caregiving in the context of a virus, in a context in which there is the decimation of the medical system in any case? How are we going to be able to give the support to that? And if you think of what we would be doing normally, if there had not been a pandemic, it would be this. It would be advocating for the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And we're about to put out a publication just to show that, in fact, in no situation in any country where there is a country-specific resolution is the Women, Peace and Security even referred to as being relevant. So this is our opportunity now to say, if ceasefire, this is what we need to have happen. This is what the Women, Peace and Security agenda says. This is the support we are going to give you. This is what we want the UN to be doing, the states to be doing, and the regional bodies. And that's quite a big ask, but we are going to be putting up information as to what that would look like. We're getting amazing guidance already from women in Yemen, Syria, saying this is what we need to have happen. And it's very different from what is coming down from those in the Security Council. So those are really, really important issues I think we need to engage in. And the other one I just want to flag now so we can discuss it a little more is under cover again of the pandemic, we are now getting femicide writ hugely large. The incidence of domestic violence has increased. In Lebanon, it's gone up 100% since the same equivalent period last year. In France, it's over 30%. In Italy, it's up 42%. And that's what we know. And in some places, it's more difficult for women to be able to communicate with potential support because they're being monitored all the time by their violent partners. So we have a crisis in that area as well, which I think we do need to put into the mix to see what our demand must be for addressing that. So it's a ceasefire, it's addressing the pandemic as a global crisis which states need to cooperate on, which we don't want the Security Council necessarily to give us a resolution on, but we need the General Assembly to recognize it as such. We need a recognition of the need for the ceasefires, and then we need to work deeply to ensure that that happens. And Ray has already spoken as to it's not just putting down the guns temporarily, you've got to work backwards, right the way through to how to stop the states giving end user certificates to those that are continuing to produce and sell weapons. And then you have how to deal with the whole issue of domestic violence. And there's a lot of work that is going out there, and we're going to put up something fairly soon, which is a compendium of information from 5 different organizations showing what actions have been done in trying to raise awareness. There's amazing work being done in Kinshasa. Some of the Men Engage Alliance are trying to put things together. And it's all about raising awareness within the households to try and prevent it in the households. Very difficult with existing abusers, but there are going to be new abusers who haven't been violent before, but because of the particular situations they find themselves in, may well now go into this line. How do you stop that? How do you engage men from their violent behavior? And isn't it appalling? We've got to have this discussion, in fact. But still, we do have to have this discussion. And then we need to think of what are we demanding of states that they do? What must we ask for? I know the Women's Equality Party in the United Kingdom has actually said there must be an automatic extension of injunctions preventing violent men returning to homes after the ending of that injunction, because they're just going to be walking back into a lockdown with the women they've been abusing. So things like that we need to be thinking of, and we need to be combining together to make these demands. I just saw in the chat box a lot of information coming in about the extent of increase in violence everywhere. Cynthia, please.
I'm just going to confirm what you were saying, but it comes back to Cynthia Coburn, the late, beloved, very much missed WILPF activist, Cynthia Coburn in England. And she helped us all develop that notion of a feminist understanding of the spectrum of violence. And I think her term was the continuum of violence, which means that if we are really interested in genuine security, you always have to ask about the masculinization of violence. And that's about who has authority around nuclear weapons and who is considered the head of a household. And that those things are not unrelated to each other. That is, the head of the household becomes the spokesperson for nuclear weapons as security. And I think let's just remind ourselves that in this time is when we really have to remind ourselves what other feminists have been teaching us. You know, that feminist understanding, feminist insights, feminist analysis, feminist ways of gaining knowledge, like the Syrian feminists on the ground. How do they create knowledge? That we know these things, and we have to be reminded that the newness of the coronavirus does not make irrelevant. In fact, it makes more relevant the kind of feminist building of reliable, usable, implementable, highly realistic, not capital R, small r, knowledge that feminism brings to danger, to crisis, to security, to genuine peace building. And as you were talking, Madeleine, I just thought, you know, Cynthia Coburn is right here in our heads. The continuum of violence, the domestic violence that so many people in the chat room are talking about. Where are the police and what are they trained to do? Where are the courts and what are they trained to do? That domestic violence and nuclear weaponry factories continuing, those are not unrelated. They are related, and it's using feminist knowledge that builds that relationship to make sure that one doesn't become irrelevant and the other hidden in these times.
That's great, Cynthia. That is such an example of, you know, again, the coronavirus has, to a certain extent, it says exemplified everything we knew. And just to say, that's what at WILPF we're trying to do. We are not changing our analysis. We are actually just applying it to real-time examples of how the system works and what we're saying must be the alternatives to that. And I think that's what you've just said, Cynthia, is exactly the approach that needs to be taken, that continuum. And as Cynthia Coburn always said, you know, gender relations is causal. Because that at the end, if you think with the violence that is starting in the home and it goes all the way up to the continuation of the expenditure on nuclear weapons, and what we're talking about is a political economy which is entirely patriarchal and violent. There's still some amazing stuff coming up in the chat room. Do we get to keep the stuff that's in the chat room? I never know this. And we've lost, unfortunately, we've lost Genevieve, who was knocked off the call. So I don't know if we are able to save this, but we certainly are going to be, I think we've recorded it, right? So we will have a record of it.
Hi, yes, I am still here. I was just temporarily booted for like 30 seconds, but yes, this call has been recorded, and we will be posting the recording fairly soon and sending it out to everyone who had registered.
Oh, that's great. So we will
have Genevieve and the chat room comments. Genevieve?
The chat, we're trying to figure out how to archive that. Zoom has some sort of issues in terms of the chat, but I have been saving I've been screenshotting all of the chat room comments, so we will figure out a way to get those to everyone.
Way clever, way clever. Feminist clever.
Feminist clever. And there's a request from Yasmin Poole to everyone. She wants your books. So can you, actually, I think, Cynthia.
Oh.
How can she see what you've written? How can she get them?
Sure. Just unfortunately, you know, you cannot hide. So just go online and go to your favorite independent bookstore. Try not to use Amazon if possible, or use it to look for the list of the books, and then go. All your independent bookstores, by the way, almost all of them are fulfilling orders online. Keep your independent bookstores in business during these hard times. Use Amazon to find out all the the bibliographic data that you need to order a book. Then don't order it through Amazon. Then order it through your independent bookstore or the one you know of online, and keep them in business. So that's one way. The Big Push, subtitled Exposing and Challenging Persistent Patriarchy, is now available in Spanish from a Spanish publisher. Wait just a minute. Wait, I'll go online. Wait just a minute. This is there's so many great Spanish feminists online. Just a minute, I'm coming back. I'm going into my messy study. Here I go. Wait, where is the Spanish version? Oh, where's the Spanish version? Ah, here we go. Wait just a minute. Whoa. I just knocked everything off my bookshelf to try and get at it. Okay, here we go. So can anyone wait, how can I do that? There it is. That's the Spanish version of The Big Push, if anyone's interested. But this is true also of Cynthia Coburn. You know, she is passed on to the great beyond, but her books are as relevant as ever, and they are very much available online. I'm not sure what other languages they've been published in, but they certainly are. Some of the stuff of mine, Maneuvers is in Korean, and it's in Japanese, and Turkish. It's in Turkish. The Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, which is much more in Nela's realm, which is the political economy of patriarchy through lots of different products and practices. That's available in French now. So you don't have to struggle and read everything in English. There's some good, and the translators tend to be very feminist-minded, I've been told, and so the translations are probably even better than the original English. That would be a help.
That's great, Cynthia. Thank you. I've read them all, and I'm so impressed always. I think the two Cynthias have taught me just about everything I know, apart from the activists that I've actually had the pleasure of working with. I've just pulled my own earphones in. Just to say, it would be very useful, I think, for people to share what books, where are your sources? Back to Cynthia's point about sharing, where are our sources? Where are our ways in which we can actually concentrate our minds during this time when some people have more time to read than normal. Jackie True, also excellent book on the political economy of violence against women. Helps a lot. Okay, I think we are sort of winding up. Can I just say, in response to a question that Tamara put forward some time ago about can we just say what WILPF is going to be doing? Please do look at our website, because we do have a separate section there now where we are posting blogs, which are basically the strands of the explanations. Everything that is going to be on there will be an explanation from a WILPF perspective. We've done the militarism, we've looked at political economy, we're going to be working on disaster capitalism, we'll be putting something out there on alternatives to the use of the military as those who are giving support to healthcare and everything else, so how to demystify this idea of the military as the heroes of the moment. We'll be looking at domestic violence, the ceasefires in more detail and what needs to be done. We'll be looking at how and in what way we should be addressing the multilateral system at the present time, and how and in what way we can be engaging with government using human rights law, using gender analysis, and trying to ensure that the local is actually made relevant to the answers to the solution, to the pandemic and how to work on it. So I think let's keep sharing the information. It's been really, I think, an excellent webinar. I've loved reading what everyone's been inputting in there. I think it shows we're all this, wherever we are in the world, we seem to be on the same page, which just shows that feminism is everywhere, and we will somehow, I think, prevail at the end of this. We know what we've got to do. So thanks to everybody, particular thanks to Ray, Nela and Cynthia for your interventions. You've really guided us extremely, I think, cogently into how to think, how to approach, and what actually we can be doing. So again, thank you all so much for joining.